He hired a virgin nanny to take care of his son, believing it would be a safe choice. But just one look was enough for desire to explode. The wife sensed danger in the air and decided to act before it was too late. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Let's continue. The Duval estate stretched across acres of vineyards in the hills of Napa Valley, its preserved colonial structures contrasting with the discreet modernity that money allowed. The main house, a century-old mansion of stone and timber, held in its wide corridors and antique European furniture, the secrets of a family that had built its empire on land and political influence. Nothing there was casual, not the orchids carefully arranged in Czech crystal vases, nor the portraits of the couple inhabiting the property, Ethan and Victoria Duval, frozen in smiles that hadn't been seen in life for a long time. Everything in that residence breathed controlled power, calculated beauty, and the illusion of a harmony that no longer existed. Ethan Duval, heir to a wine dynasty with roots lost in the 19th century, carried in his dark eyes the coldness of someone who had learned to command before learning to love. At 42, he controlled not only vineyards and businesses, but also silences and wills with the same precision as selecting the best grapes for export. Married for 13 years to Victoria, a former ballerina with the San Francisco Ballet, their relationship was sustained by social appearances, unspoken agreements, and a mutual guilt that neither dared to name. She, still elegant at 38, had transformed into a shadow of the vibrant woman she once was, consumed by jealousy, by cruel comparison with her own lost youth, and by the glaring absence of her husband's true desire. The couple had a son, Michael, just 3 years old. After the sudden disappearance of the previous nanny, a matter buried in silences and checks signed without questions, there arose an urgent need for a new caregiver. Victoria, driven by the need to keep every detail of family life under her absolute control, decided to personally select the replacement. She chose carefully. She wanted someone with an inoffensive appearance, without experience in wealthy households, and above all, without the beauty that might awaken any interest from her husband. Her choice fell on Sarah Collins. Sarah arrived on a humid March afternoon, when the summer rain still insisted on making their presence felt in the Napa Hills. She brought a worn leather suitcase, a gaze that tried to disguise fear, and a soul marked by scars that no one could see. At 22, she came from rural Georgia, raised in a strict evangelical family where her father exercised the role of pastor with unquestionable authority, and her mother maintained silence as a second religion. Her slender body almost hid her natural curves under conservative clothes, and her inexperience with men was less a choice than the result of a lifetime of repression, where any impulse considered impure was severely punished. Crossing the electronic gates of the Duval estate was like entering a forbidden world that she only knew through soap operas she watched in secret. Sarah felt the weight of invisible gazes upon her before even ringing the doorbell of the main house. Ethan observed her from the upper balcony, motionless, with an expression she couldn't immediately interpret. It was hunger, disguised as curiosity. Not just the physical desire any man might feel, but something more primitive and dangerous, the fascination of someone accustomed to possessing everything except what remained untouched by the world. Sarah carried, without being aware, exactly what disturbed him, a wounded purity that deeply disconcerted him. Victoria noticed. She saw the precise moment when her husband's gaze lingered on the slender silhouette of the new nanny. It wasn't casual interest or professional approval. It was thirst, disguised as evaluation. Panic came like an icy wave climbing up her spine. She knew that too intimate look. She had felt its heat upon herself years ago, before it disappeared inside Ethan like everything that was once genuine between them. Burning with anticipated jealousy, she decided to keep Sarah very close, feigning maternal generosity, offering dresses she no longer wore, calculated compliments, invitations to dine at the family table, when staff normally ate in the kitchen. But there was a cruel strategy behind every forced smile. She didn't just want to control Sarah. She wanted to infiltrate her mind, shape her, make the girl see her as an absolute model, as a dominant and protective figure. Victoria wanted to relive her own youth through Sarah, but sculpting her exactly according to her needs and fears. Sarah, however, wasn't as naive as her appearance suggested. Although she had never been touched by any man, her body and soul began to awaken in the disturbing presence of her employer. The nights became endless battles against thoughts that her strict upbringing classified as sinful. She frequently dreamed of him, not in explicit scenes of lust, but in inexplicable and intense situations. Ethan watching her sleep through the window, touching her hands with almost religious reverence, saving her from invisible dangers that only she perceived. The sexual repression of a lifetime transformed her nascent desires into feverish delusions. And the estate seemed to amplify every sensation. There was something in the old house that whispered secrets during the early hours, an ornate mirror in the guest room that reflected strange shadows, soft voices echoing from the abandoned garden in the east wing, a forbidden space where, according to the oldest staff member's whispers, a former nanny had been found dead years ago in a scandal that the family had buried under mountains of silence and dirty money. While caring for Michael, Sarah approached the child with an instinctive tenderness that disarmed even her own distrust. The 3-year-old boy, with his father's dark eyes but without his calculating coldness, seemed to recognize in her something that not even his own parents offered, a genuine presence without ulterior motives or power games. Ethan observed these interactions with a growing obsession that he himself couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just physical desire, although that element pulsed under his skin whenever she came near, but a kind of sick fascination mixed with something that could be tenderness, if he were still capable of recognizing such a feeling. He felt a primal need to protect her, as if she were something rare and fragile that needed to be preserved from the world, or perhaps, in a darker interpretation he preferred not to explore, she was just another object to be possessed by a man who confused personal redemption with absolute possession. During the afternoons when Victoria was away at Pilates classes in town, or meetings with the other wives of the Napa Valley rural elite, Ethan created pretexts to move around the house. He would appear in the playroom where Sarah entertained Michael, offering unnecessary help or asking questions about his son's routine that any present father should already know. His eyes lingered on her delicate gestures, how she held the boy in her arms, how she hummed songs she had learned in her Georgian childhood, how her brown hair escaped from her ponytail when she bent down to pick up a toy. Sarah felt the weight of that gaze, like a sweet and disturbing burn. Her virginally inexperienced body reacted with an intensity that frightened her. Her heart raced, her hands trembled slightly, and something deep in her belly contracted every time he came close enough for her to smell his masculine cologne mixed with the aroma of wine that permeated his clothes. Victoria noticed each of these moments with the cruel precision of a woman who had spent years observing her husband's emotional infidelities. As she felt the ground slipping beneath her feet, both in Ethan's heart and in the absolute control she exercised over the house dynamics, she began to implement more subtle and poisonous strategies. She started with seemingly innocent insinuations during dinners, comments about how certain people could take advantage of the generosity of kind employers, made up stories about nannies who had caused problems in other families in the region, pointed observations about the importance of maintaining clear professional boundaries. Then came more direct attacks, notes strategically left in Sarah's room questioning schedules, veiled criticisms about her clothes or behavior, and constant surveillance disguised as maternal interest. One particularly quiet night, when Michael was already asleep and Victoria had taken her usual sedatives, Sarah went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. The big house seemed even bigger in the darkness, its corridors echoing each barefoot step on the waxed wooden floor. It was then that, passing through the main living room, she gave in to an impulse she had been suppressing for weeks. With the sound system softly playing a gentle jazz melody, Sarah began to dance alone, eyes closed, lost in movements that sprang from a natural sensuality she didn't know she possessed. It was an intimate and unconscious dance, where she finally allowed her body to express the desires her mind censored during the day. She didn't know that Ethan was there, hidden in the shadows of the staircase, observing every movement with an intensity that bordered on veneration. He remained motionless for long minutes, hypnotized by the erotic purity of that moment, feeling something awakening inside him that had been dormant for years. The tension accumulated over weeks finally reached its breaking point on a rainy April afternoon. Michael, playing alone on the covered porch while Sarah organized his toys, decided to climb the stone parapet to reach a colorful butterfly. The boy lost his balance, and began to fall toward the garden 3 meters below. Sarah reacted out of pure instinct, throwing herself forward and managing to grab the child's arm at the last second. But the impact against the stone wall left a deep cut on her forehead and severely scratched her right arm. Ethan came running when he heard Michael's scream, finding Sarah sitting on the floor with the child safe in her arms, blood flowing down her pale face. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, holding her face with an urgency and tenderness he had never shown even to his own wife. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the wound, his dark eyes filled with a genuine concern that deeply surprised her. It was in that touch that something irreversible broke between them. Sarah began to cry, not from physical pain but from an emotional avalanche she had been containing for months. His proximity, the smell of his skin, the feeling of his calloused but gentle hands touching her face, all mixed in an overwhelming intensity. Without thinking of the consequences, Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest as she sobbed quietly. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for both to know that something fundamental had changed between them, and Victoria saw everything. She was standing at the porch door, having arrived silently during the accident, and witnessed the entire scene with a painful clarity that cut through her soul like a blade. In the following days, the atmosphere in the house became dense and charged like the air before an electrical storm. Sarah began to wear some of the dresses Victoria had offered her at the beginning, elegant but not extravagant pieces that enhanced her natural beauty without seeming inappropriate for her position. What she didn't know was that these were the same dresses Victoria wore at the beginning of her marriage, when there was still passion in Ethan's gaze. It was a calculated cruelty from her employer, a way to torture herself and simultaneously test how far her husband's interest in the nanny extended. Ethan, in turn, began to actively avoid his wife, creating excuses to work later in the office, making unnecessary trips to other vineyards, anything to avoid having to pretend normalcy during family dinners. It was on one of those suffocating May afternoons, when the silence of the house weighed like a wet blanket over all its inhabitants, that Victoria finally broke. The last straw was simple and devastating. She went down to fetch Michael from the garden and found Ethan teaching Sarah to identify the different varieties of grapes that grew on the family lands. He was standing right behind her, his hands guiding hers as she touched the still green grapes, explaining with a patience and gentleness that Victoria hadn't seen in years. The intimacy of the moment, seemingly innocent but charged with a palpable sexual tension, made something explode inside the betrayed woman's chest. That same night, during dinner, Victoria served the wine with mechanical gestures and began to speak. Her voice was controlled, almost sweet, but her words fell like acid on the solid wooden table. She began by telling Sarah about the previous nanny, Jessica, a pretty girl from San Francisco, who had worked for them for almost 2 years. She described how Jessica had fallen hopelessly in love with Ethan, how she had begun to behave inappropriately, making increasingly obvious advances. And then, with calculated cruelty, she revealed how it all ended. Jessica had been found dead in the abandoned garden of the East Wing on a cold August morning. Officially, it was recorded as an accident. She had slipped and hit her head on the stones of the old fountain. But Victoria planted the seed of doubt with surgical precision, suggesting that perhaps it had been suicide, the despair of a woman who couldn't handle the rejection of her employer. Sarah felt her blood freeze in her veins. Ethan remained motionless, his eyes fixed on his plate, neither denying nor confirming his wife's words. His silence was more terrifying than any confession. After that dinner, Sarah began to see the house with different eyes. The corridors seemed longer and more threatening, the shadows moved strangely at the corners of vision, and the forbidden garden exerted a morbid attraction that she tried to resist but couldn't completely ignore. She began to dream of Jessica, a woman with a blurred face who walked the corridors of the house calling her name, whispering warnings that she couldn't understand upon waking. The following weeks brought a subtle but noticeable change in Ethan's behavior. He stopped creating excuses to approach Sarah, avoided being alone with her, and when their lives inevitably crossed during activities with Michael, he maintained a respectful but cold distance. It was as if Victoria's words had erected an invisible barrier between them. Sarah interpreted this as rejection and felt a sharp pain that surprised her with its intensity. She didn't yet realize that Ethan was fighting against himself, trying to protect her from something he didn't fully understand, whether it was from himself or from the destructive forces that seemed to inhabit that house. It was then that the first messages arrived. Handwritten notes left under her bedroom door, letters delivered by mail addressed to Emma Collins, a name that made Sarah's world crumble instantly. Someone had discovered her real name, her true identity, that she had tried to bury when she fled Georgia. The notes were vague but threatening, talking about past sins that need to be paid, and lies that cannot remain hidden forever. The sender identified themselves only as a friend concerned with the truth. Sarah burned all the letters, but fear settled in her chest like a caged wild animal. Victoria noticed the change in the nanny's behavior, how she startled at sudden noises, how she obsessively checked if doors were locked, how her eyes had acquired a constant vigilance that didn't exist before. With the sharpened intuition of an experienced predator, she knew something was happening. She discreetly hired a private detective from San Francisco, a man specialized in investigating the past of domestic employees. She told him she suspected Sarah wasn't who she claimed to be, that there was something suspicious about her documentation and the references she had presented. What she didn't expect was to discover something much darker and more complex than simple document falsification. Sarah, terrified by the possibility of her past being discovered, began to make desperate escape plans. She saved every penny of her salary, studied bus routes to distant cities, even went so far as to steal some small valuable objects from the house that she could sell in case of extreme emergency. But something kept her bound to that place beyond fear. It was Ethan. Even with all the distance he had put between them after Victoria's revealing dinner, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about him, desiring his cautious touches, fantasizing about possibilities that her religious education would classify as sinful. During sleepless nights, she masturbated for the first time in her life, imagining his hands exploring her virgin body, whispering her real name with a tenderness that contrasted with the usual hardness of his personality. The anonymous messages became more specific and threatening. One of them contained intimate details about her family in Georgia, about the scandal that had destroyed her father's congregation, Pastor Robert Collins, accused of sexual abuse against minor girls in the religious community. Another letter brought an old photograph of her at 16 during a church party, smiling innocently alongside other young women who would later become victims of her father's crimes. The mysterious sender knew that she had legally changed her name after turning 18, that she had testified against her own father during the trial, and that she had fled Georgia when she discovered that some members of the old congregation had sworn revenge against her for destroying a man of God with diabolic lies. Ethan began to notice that something was terrifying Sarah. He observed how she avoided certain rooms in the house, how she always walked looking over her shoulder, how her hands trembled when mail was delivered. One morning, he found her crying silently in the garden while Michael played on the grass, and something inside him broke definitively. He approached slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal, and gently asked if she was okay. Sarah looked at him with red, tear-filled eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived at the estate, her mask of serenity fell completely. She stammered that everything was fine, that it was just fatigue, but her broken voice betrayed the desperation she felt. It was at that moment that Ethan made a decision that would change everything. Without saying a word, he knelt on the grass beside her and simply stayed there, offering his presence as silent consolation. He didn't touch her, didn't ask questions, just remained close enough for her to feel that she wasn't alone in her anguish. Michael, sensing the tension of the adults with the natural sensitivity of children, approached and climbed into Sarah's lap, offering her a wet kiss on the cheek. The spontaneous tenderness of the boy made Sarah cry even more, but now they were tears of painful gratitude for these rare moments of genuine humanity amid the emotional chaos her life had become. The detective's report arrived in a brown envelope on a rainy Tuesday. Victoria opened it alone in her private office, with hands trembling from anxiety and expectation. What she found was much more devastating than she could have imagined. Sarah Collins was, in fact, Emma Collins, daughter of Pastor Robert Collins, sentenced to 15 years in prison for sexual abuse of minors in his evangelical congregation. But the most shocking revelation wasn't about the father's crimes. It was about Emma. During the trial, several witnesses had stated that she was not just a victim, but also a silent accomplice, knowing about the abuses and helping her father attract other girls to vulnerable situations. One of the victims, Megan Wilson, had attempted suicide after the trial, leaving a letter blaming Emma for her emotional destruction. Emma had fled Georgia not only to escape the community's revenge, but also to flee from her own guilt. Victoria read and reread the report, feeling a toxic mixture of triumph and horror. She finally had in her hands the ultimate weapon to destroy any interest Ethan might have in the nanny. But at the same time, a part of her, the part that still maintained fragments of the compassionate woman she had been before the marriage consumed her, felt a painful empathy for the young woman who had grown up in an environment of religious manipulation and abuse. She decided to keep the information as a trump card, waiting for the right moment to use her devastating knowledge. Meanwhile, Emma continued to receive threatening messages, which now included specific details about her life at the Duval estate. The anonymous sender knew about her schedules, about her clothes, about her interactions with Ethan. One of the most disturbing letters included a photo of her taken through her bedroom window, showing her sleeping in her white nightgown. The terror intensified when she realized that someone was not only investigating her past, but also currently watching her. She began to sleep with a chair against the door, obsessively checked if the windows were locked, and developed a constant state of paranoia that began to affect her ability to properly care for Michael. Ethan noticed the deterioration of Emma's emotional state and made a decision that surprised even himself. One afternoon, when Victoria had traveled to San Francisco for a medical appointment, he approached Emma in the garden and confronted her directly. He said he could see that she was terrified by something, that he could no longer pretend he didn't see her suffering. For the first time since the accident with Michael, he deliberately touched her, placing his hands on her shoulders and looking directly into her eyes as he said that, regardless of what was happening, she didn't need to face it alone. Ethan's unexpected kindness broke Emma's defenses completely. Between tears and sobs, she told him about the anonymous letters, about the threats, about the terror of being discovered. She didn't reveal the specific details of her real identity or the family scandal, but made it clear that she had fled from a violent past and that someone was trying to force her to return. Ethan listened in silence, his jaw becoming increasingly tense as he understood the extent of her fear. When she finished speaking, he pulled her into his arms without hesitation, holding her against his chest in a fierce and possessive protection. It was the first truly intimate embrace between them. Emma could feel the accelerated beat of Ethan's heart, the warmth of his body through his cotton shirt, the masculine smell of his skin mixed with wine and earth. Their bodies fit together in a way that seemed natural and inevitable, as if they had been created for that specific moment. Ethan buried his face in her hair, inhaling her soft flower scent, feeling more alive than he had felt in years. For some precious minutes they remained like this, lost in an intimacy that transcended physical desire and touched something deeper and more dangerous. Reality returned when they heard the noise of Victoria's car arriving earlier than expected. They separated quickly, but not before Ethan whispered in her ear that he wouldn't allow anyone to hurt her, that he would find a way to protect her. His words carried a promise that sounded more like a declaration of war than simple consolation. Emma felt something awaken inside her, not just gratitude, but a dangerous passion for this man who offered protection when everything in her life seemed to be falling apart. Victoria got out of the car with the detective's report, burning inside her Italian leather purse. She saw Ethan and Emma moving away from each other in the garden, with a forced casualness that didn't fool anyone. The sexual tension between them was so palpable that it seemed to vibrate in the air like heat waves. At that moment, she knew the time had come to use her most powerful weapon. During dinner that night, with a theatrical calm that masked her inner fury, Victoria began to talk about loyalty, about trust, about how important it was to truly know the people we allow into our lives. Her eyes fixed on Emma as she spoke, and each word was chosen with the precision of a scalpel. After Michael was put to bed, Victoria asked Emma to accompany her to her office for a private conversation. Ethan tried to interfere, saying that any matter related to the employee could be discussed in his presence as well, but Victoria was inflexible. It was a matter between women, she said, and he had no place in that conversation. Emma followed her employer with her heart pounding in her chest, sensing that her final hour had come. In the elegantly furnished office, Surrounded by art books and photographs of the Duval family over the years, Victoria closed the door and positioned herself behind the mahogany desk, creating a physical and psychological barrier between them. With a soft voice but loaded with venom, Victoria began to recite the details of the detective's report. She spoke about Pastor Robert Collins, about the destroyed congregation, about the abused girls, about the trial that shook the small Georgian town. Emma was paralyzed, feeling the blood drain from her face as each word revealed that all her secrets had been discovered. But the worst was yet to come. Victoria revealed that she knew about Emma's ambiguous role in the scandal, about the accusations of complicity, about Megan Wilson and her suicide attempt. With calculated cruelty, she suggested that perhaps Emma had come to work as a nanny because she had disturbing predilections, that perhaps she represented a danger to Michael. Emma tried to defend herself, to explain that she was just a child when it all happened, that she had also been a victim of her father's psychological manipulation, that she had never intentionally hurt anyone, but her words sounded weak and desperate even to her own ears. Victoria wasn't interested in hearing explanations. She was interested in destroying any possibility of competition for her husband's affection. With an icy smile, she informed Emma that she had until dawn to leave the estate. If she didn't depart voluntarily, Victoria would call the police and report her suspicions about Michael's safety. She also revealed that she had contacts in the local media who would be very interested to know that the daughter of the pedophile pastor was working as a nanny in a prominent Napa Valley family. Emma left the office staggering, feeling as if she had taken a physical beating. Her legs could barely support her as she climbed the stairs to her room, where she locked herself in and collapsed on the bed, sobbing with a pain that seemed to tear her soul. Everything she had fought for, the chance to start over, to be seen as a person beyond her father's sins, to find perhaps even love, was being taken from her again. But this time the prospect of losing Ethan hurt more than any public humiliation. She had fallen in love with him without realizing it, and now she would be forced to flee again, carrying not only the scars of the past, but also a broken heart for a love that could never be consummated. Emma spent the night packing with mechanical movements, her tears falling on the clothes she carefully folded. Each piece of clothing, each personal object she packed, carried memories of the past months on the estate, moments of genuine happiness she never thought she could experience. At dawn, she was sitting on the edge of the bed with her suitcase beside her, waiting for the right moment to leave without being seen. She planned to leave a letter for Michael explaining her sudden departure, inventing some family emergency that a 3-year-old could understand without being traumatized. It was then that she heard soft knocks at the door. She thought it might be Victoria coming to ensure she was fulfilling the agreement, but the voice she heard from the other side completely surprised her. It was Ethan, whispering her name with an urgency that made her heart dangerously accelerate. Emma slowly opened the door, finding him standing in the hallway still in sleepwear, a white t-shirt and cotton pajama pants that revealed his masculine silhouette in a way that made something contract in her belly. His dark hair was disheveled. His eyes carried an intensity she had never seen, and there was a determination in his posture that left her speechless. Ethan entered her room without asking permission, closing the door behind him with a care that contrasted with the urgency of his movements. He saw the closed suitcase beside the bed and immediately understood what was happening. Victoria had told him about the private conversation with Emma, but had completely omitted the details of what was discussed. She had only said that she had discovered some inconsistencies in the nanny's past and had decided to dismiss her for safety reasons. Ethan, knowing his wife well enough to recognize her manipulations, knew there was much more behind that sudden decision. He approached Emma slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might flee at any abrupt movement. He asked directly what Victoria had discovered, what she had used to force her to leave. Emma tried to lie, to invent some vague excuse, but Ethan's eyes didn't allow falsehood. There was an intensity in them that demanded complete truth, a connection that made it impossible to maintain lies between them. With a broken voice, Emma began to tell her real story about her father, about the destroyed congregation, about the accusations that pursued her, about the guilt she carried for not being strong enough to prevent the abuses when she was just a terrified teenager. Ethan listened to every word in silence, his jaw becoming tenser with each revelation, but his eyes never strayed from her face, and Emma saw no judgment or revulsion in his expression, only a painful understanding and a growing anger directed not at her, but at those who had hurt her. When she finished speaking, Ethan remained silent for long moments, processing everything he had heard. Then, without any hesitation, he said that he didn't care about her past, that the only thing that mattered was the woman she had become, the way she cared for Michael, the kindness she showed even when she was suffering. His words broke the last barrier of resistance Emma maintained. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his chest while he held her with a protective strength that made her feel safe for the first time in years. Ethan murmured words of comfort in her ear, promising that he wouldn't allow Victoria or anyone else to force her to leave, that he would find a way to protect her from threats and blackmail. But Emma knew he was making promises he couldn't keep. Victoria held all the cards, and any attempt to resist would only result in more destruction for everyone involved. It was in that moment of shared desperation that something fundamental changed between them. The air in the room seemed to become denser, charged with a sexual tension that had been growing for months and finally found its opportunity to manifest. Ethan lowered his eyes to Emma's face, seeing her tears, her parted lips, the absolute vulnerability in her dark eyes. She looked at him with an intensity that made him completely forget where they were, who they were, what the consequences of what was about to happen might be. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, Ethan bent his head and touched her lips with his, in a kiss that began soft and hesitant, but quickly deepened into a desperate passion. Emma had imagined this moment countless times during her sleepless nights, but reality surpassed all her fantasies. Ethan's lips were firm and warm, moving against hers with a skill that awakened sensations she didn't even know existed in her virgin body. Her hands intertwined in his hair, pulling him closer while he pressed her against the wall of the room. The kiss became more urgent, more desperate, loaded with months of repressed desire and the pain of imminent separation. Ethan moaned softly against her lips, a primitive sound that made something explode in the center of Emma's body. His hands began to explore her body through the thin cotton nightgown, tracing the curves he had observed from afar for so many weeks. Emma arched her body against his touch, feeling an urgent need she didn't completely understand, but that consumed her entirely. Ethan broke the kiss to look into her eyes, checking if she wanted him to continue, if she wasn't being forced by the desperation of the moment. What he saw was pure desire, a hunger that mirrored his own, and this broke his last resistance. With reverent movements, as if she were something sacred that could break, Ethan began to unbutton the top of her nightgown. Emma trembled when his hands touched her bare skin for the first time, but not from fear, from an anticipation that made every nerve in her body sing. She had never been touched by a man, but with Ethan she felt no shame or anxiety, only a sense of completeness, as if that moment had been inevitable since the first day they met. The sound of footsteps in the corridor brought them brutally back to reality. Victoria was awake, walking through the house with the insomnia that had tormented her since she discovered the attraction between her husband and the nanny. They separated quickly, heavy breathing, disheveled clothes, eyes still dark with unsatisfied desire. Ethan whispered that this wasn't over, that he would find a way for them to be together, that he wouldn't allow her to leave. Emma wanted to believe, but she knew they were playing with fire in a house full of gunpowder. After Ethan silently left the room, Emma leaned against the wall where he had kissed her, touching her still sensitive lips, trying to process the intensity of what had happened. Her body was awake in a completely new way, pulsing with needs she didn't know how to satisfy. She knew she had crossed a line she could never go back from, that she had officially become the lover of a married man, even if she was still physically a virgin. The Christian guilt of her upbringing fought against the desire Ethan had awakened in her, creating an internal conflict that left her nauseated with confusion. On the other side of the house, Ethan returned to the conjugal bedroom he shared with Victoria, finding her awake in bed, pretending to read a magazine. She looked at him with calculating eyes, noticing his disheveled hair, his breathing still not completely normalized, the subtle perfume of Emma that clung to his skin. She said nothing, but her icy smile made it clear that she knew exactly where he had been and what had happened. The silent war between them had officially begun, and Emma was trapped in the center of an emotional battlefield that could destroy everyone involved. The following days were a refined torture for all the inhabitants of the estate. Emma remained in the house against Victoria's ultimatum, protected by Ethan's iron insistence that firing the nanny without just cause could generate unnecessary legal problems. Victoria temporarily accepted the excuse, but her revenge took more subtle and cruel forms. She began to treat Emma with an icy courtesy that was more humiliating than any open hostility, made seemingly innocent comments about morality and trust during meals, and intensified her surveillance over every movement of the young woman. Ethan tried to create opportunities to be alone with Emma, but Victoria had become an omnipresent shadow, always appearing at the most inopportune moments with elaborate excuses. The unconsummated sexual tension between them grew with each stolen glance, each accidental touch of hands when passing plates during dinner. Each moment their bodies came close while caring for Michael. Emma felt as if she were on fire inside, her virgin body awakened by Ethan pulsing with needs she didn't know how to satisfy. It was during one of these tormented, sleepless nights that Emma made a decision that would change the course of all events. She could no longer bear the uncertainty, the constant fear, the feeling of living a lie. She decided that if she was going to be forced to leave, she would at least discover the truth about the previous nanny. Perhaps by finding answers about Jessica, she could better understand the destructive pattern that seemed to repeat itself in the Duval house. Perhaps she could save herself from the same tragic fate. In the darkest dawn of the week, Emma silently left her room and headed to the forbidden garden in the East Wing. The place had been abandoned for years, covered by wild vegetation growing uncontrolled among the ancient stones of what was once a formal garden. In the center, there was a cracked marble fountain where, according to rumors whispered by the staff, Jessica had been found dead. Emma walked there with her heart beating violently, using only the light of her cell phone to guide her steps among the plants that clung to her legs like ghostly hands. It was then that she saw something that made her blood freeze. Hidden behind the fountain, partially buried under dry leaves and earth, was a small chest of dark wood. With trembling hands, Emma completely unearthed it and managed to force the rusty lock. Inside, she found a diary bound in red leather, several photographs, and some personal objects that clearly belonged to a young woman. The diary was dated 2 years ago, and the first pages were by Jessica Reed, the previous nanny. The first entries were innocent, describing her arrival at the estate, her first impressions of the Duval family, the joy of caring for Michael when he was still a baby. But as Emma continued reading, the story became increasingly dark and familiar. Jessica described her growing attraction to Ethan, the looks that began innocently but became loaded with meaning, the way he began to create excuses to be near her. She also described Victoria's growing paranoia, the veiled accusations, the feeling of being constantly observed and judged. But the most shocking entries were at the end of the diary. Jessica had discovered that she wasn't the first nanny to become emotionally involved with Ethan. There had been others before her, a pattern that repeated every 2 or 3 years. Emma read with growing horror about how Victoria deliberately orchestrated these situations. She always chose young and vulnerable women, brought them close to Ethan knowing he would feel attracted to their purity and need for protection, and then used that attraction as a weapon to torment both her husband and the employees. The last entry in the diary revealed the most terrifying truth of all. Jessica had discovered that Victoria wasn't a victim of Ethan's emotional betrayals. She was the architect of them. She deliberately created situations where Ethan fell in love with women whom she later destroyed, as a sick way of maintaining absolute control over her husband and punishing his inability to truly love her. It was a perverse psychological game, where she fed on the destruction of other women to validate her own position as the indispensable wife. Emma felt nausea rising in her throat as she understood that she had fallen exactly into the same trap as Jessica. The entire situation had been orchestrated from the beginning: her hiring, the forced proximity to Ethan, even the anonymous threats that terrorized her. With trembling hands, she turned the last pages of the diary and found an entry that made her scream in terror. Jessica had discovered that the anonymous letters came from Victoria, that the employer herself was behind the threats and blackmail, and in the last entry, dated the night of her death, Jessica wrote that she had decided to confront Victoria directly, that she couldn't bear living in that psychological hell any longer. The revelation hit Emma like lightning. Jessica hadn't committed suicide nor died accidentally. She had been murdered by Victoria, who couldn't allow her cruel psychological games to be exposed. Emma was reading the diary of a dead woman, a woman who had faced exactly the same situation she was living now. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold the diary, but she forced herself to continue reading. Jessica had hidden evidence about Victoria's emotional crimes, photographs of previous nannies, letters that proved systematic manipulation. Everything was there, buried with the diary waiting to be discovered. Among the photographs, Emma found faces of young women she didn't know, but who had the same expression of vulnerability and fear that she herself saw in the mirror. There were at least 6 different women, all appearing to be between 20 and 25 years old, all with the same fragile beauty that seemed to attract Ethan. On the back of each photo were dates and handwritten notes by Jessica, documenting the pattern of behavior that Victoria obsessively repeated. One of the oldest photos was of a woman named Carla, dated 5 years ago, with the notation, "Found dead in the river, suicide," in Jessica's uncertain handwriting. Emma understood with growing horror that she wasn't just the second victim of this sick game. She was part of a long and meticulously planned series of destructions. Victoria not only tolerated Ethan's attractions to other women, she deliberately orchestrated them to later psychologically destroy both the rivals and her husband himself. It was a perverse way of maintaining absolute control, of feeling powerful and indispensable, of punishing Ethan for never having truly loved her the way she desired to be loved. The sound of approaching footsteps made Emma freeze in terror. Someone was walking through the abandoned garden toward her, and by the cadence of the steps, she immediately knew it was Victoria. Quickly, Emma stored the diary and the most important photographs inside her nightgown, buried the chest again and tried to hide behind the fountain. But it was too late. Victoria appeared in the clearing, illuminated by the full moon, with an expression that mixed triumph and murderous fury. The older woman approached slowly, savoring the obvious terror in Emma's eyes. She said she had been waiting for this moment, that she knew sooner or later curiosity would lead Emma there, exactly as had happened with Jessica. She confessed with a terrifying tranquility that she had observed Emma reading the diary, that she knew exactly what she had discovered. Victoria explained with cruel details how she had pushed Jessica into the fountain during the final confrontation, how she had watched the girl die drowning in the shallow water while begging for mercy. Emma tried to run, but Victoria had brought a kitchen knife hidden in the folds of her silk robe. The blade gleamed under the moonlight as she blocked the only exit from the abandoned garden. With a sweet and venomous voice, Victoria explained that Emma had become a problem that needed to be permanently solved. She said she would tell everyone that the nanny had fled during the night, leaving only a letter confessing her true identity and asking forgiveness for the problems caused. Ethan would be devastated once again, and Victoria would be there to console him, to be the only constant in his life of destructive relationships. Emma slowly backed away, keeping her eyes fixed on the knife that trembled in Victoria's hand. The abandoned garden seemed to have transformed into a nightmare setting, with the shadows of trees creating threatening shapes that danced under the unstable light of the moon. Victoria continued speaking with that disturbing tranquility, describing in detail how she had planned Jessica's death, how she had felt pleasure seeing the despair in the girl's eyes in her final moments. It was as if she were reliving a moment of ecstasy, feeding on the memory of the violence she had committed. It was then that Emma made a desperate decision. Instead of continuing to back away, she threw herself forward, taking Victoria by surprise. The two women fell on the irregular ground of the garden, struggling for control of the knife. Emma was younger and more agile, but Victoria had the advantage of experience and the accumulated fury of years. The fight was brutal and silent, each trying not to make noise that could wake the house. Victoria managed to superficially cut Emma's arm, but the young woman retaliated with a knee to the stomach that left the older woman breathless. During the struggle, Jessica's diary fell from Emma's nightgown, its pages scattering on the ground wet with dew. Victoria saw the evidence of her crimes exposed, and her fury intensified into an animal violence. She managed to push Emma against the marble fountain, exactly where Jessica had died, and raised the knife for the final blow. It was at that moment that a male voice cut through the darkness like lightning. Ethan was standing at the entrance to the garden, having been awakened by the sound of the struggle. His eyes took a few seconds to process the scene before him, Emma bleeding on the ground, Victoria standing over her with a knife, the pages of the diary scattered like accusing evidence. The expression on his face went through several transformations: confusion, understanding, horror, and finally a cold anger that Emma had never seen before. Ethan advanced toward the two women with measured steps, his voice coming out low and controlled, more threatening than any shout. Victoria tried to explain, to invent some story about Emma attacking her, about self-defense. But the evidence was there on the wet ground. Jessica's diary, the photographs of the other victims, the truth irrefutably exposed. Ethan picked up some pages of the diary, reading quickly under the light of his cell phone, his expression becoming darker with each word. When he finished reading, he looked at his wife as if she were a stranger, as if he were seeing her true face for the first time after years of marriage based on lies and manipulation. Emma took advantage of the moment of distraction to stand up, still staggering from the adrenaline and the wound on her arm. Ethan moved instinctively to protect her, placing himself between her and Victoria like a human shield. The power dynamic had completely reversed. Now it was Victoria who was cornered, holding a knife that seemed insignificant before her husband's icy fury and the exposed truth of her crimes. She tried one last manipulation, crying and saying she had done everything for love, that she couldn't bear to see Ethan fall in love with other women, that she just wanted to preserve the family. Ethan responded with a coldness that cut deeper than any blade. He said she had systematically destroyed everything he could have loved, that she had transformed his life into an emotional prison where he couldn't trust his own feelings. He revealed that he had suspected something for years, but never imagined the extent of Victoria's cruelty. He said she wasn't his wife. She was a murderer who had killed innocent women to feed her sick obsession with control. The situation reached its climax when Victoria, realizing she had completely lost the game, made one last desperate attempt. She threw herself toward Emma with the knife raised, preferring to destroy her rival than accept defeat. But Ethan was prepared. He intercepted the attack, holding Victoria's wrist with enough force to make her drop the weapon. In the ensuing struggle, Victoria lost her balance and fell into the fountain exactly as Jessica had fallen years before. The poetic irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The murderer had met her end in the same place where she had committed her crimes. But unlike Jessica, Victoria didn't die immediately. She lay in the shallow water of the fountain with her right arm clearly broken and a deep cut on her head, but conscious and still trying to manipulate the situation. She begged Ethan, saying it had been an accident, that she just wanted to protect the family, that everything could be forgotten if they just called an ambulance and kept secret what had happened. Her voice was weak, but still carried that sick manipulation that had been her main weapon for so many years. Ethan looked at his injured wife without showing any compassion. He said she had had her chance to confess the truth, to ask forgiveness for the lives she had destroyed, but had chosen to continue lying until the end. He took his cell phone, and instead of calling an ambulance as Victoria expected, called the police directly. While speaking with the sheriff, explaining the situation clearly and objectively, Emma carefully collected all the pages of Jessica's diary and the photographs that proved the pattern of Victoria's crimes. The time between the call and the arrival of the police passed in a surreal tension. Victoria alternated between trying to manipulate Ethan and making veiled threats about the legal consequences of denouncing her. She said he would also be investigated, that his reputation would be ruined, that Michael would grow up knowing his father had destroyed his own mother, but her words no longer had power over him. Ethan had finally seen through all the layers of manipulation and emotional blackmail that Victoria had used to control him for years. Emma remained silent during this agonizing wait, pressing a cloth against the cut on her arm while processing everything that had happened. She felt as if she had been born again, as if the invisible shackles that bound her to the past had been definitively broken. Not only had she survived the murder attempt, but she had exposed the truth about Jessica and all the other victims of Victoria. For the first time since she had arrived at the estate, she felt truly free. When the police finally arrived, followed closely by an ambulance and social workers who came to care for Michael, the scene in the abandoned garden looked like something out of a nightmare. Victoria was removed from the fountain and taken to the hospital under police custody, still trying to convince the officers that she was the victim of a conspiracy between her husband and his lover. The sheriff, an experienced man named Miller, who had worked on the case of Jessica's death years before, examined the evidence with growing interest. The pages of the diary were carefully collected as evidence, along with the photographs and other objects that Jessica had hidden. Sheriff Miller admitted to Ethan that he had always suspected Jessica's death wasn't accidental, but didn't have enough evidence to reopen the investigation at the time. Now, with Emma's testimony and the documentary evidence, he could finally do justice not only for Jessica, but potentially for other victims of Victoria who had been recorded as suicides or accidents over the years. Emma gave her statement at the police station until dawn, telling everything from her arrival at the estate to the final confrontation in the garden. Ethan remained by her side throughout the process, holding her hand when the memories became too painful, offering details she had forgotten due to the trauma. For the first time, they were truly united against a common enemy, and this shared battle had strengthened the bond between them in a way that stolen romantic moments never could have achieved. The following months were a whirlwind of legal procedures, investigations, and emotional reconstruction. Victoria survived her injuries, but was formally charged with Jessica's murder and the attempted homicide of Emma. The investigations expanded when other families in the region began to report suspicious deaths of domestic employees over the years, creating a case that shocked the entire Napa Valley rural community. Ethan found himself at the center of a media scandal, but faced everything with an iron determination that surprised even Emma. Michael, protected from complete knowledge of his mother's crimes, was told only that she was sick and needed to stay away for a long time. The child, with the natural resilience of the young, gradually adapted to the new reality where Emma had become his only constant maternal figure. Ethan hired the best child psychologists to ensure that the trauma of the situation wouldn't permanently affect his son's emotional development. During this chaotic period, Emma and Ethan finally had time and space to explore their feelings without the constant pressure of Victoria's manipulations. Without the controlling wife orchestrating every movement in the house, they discovered that their attraction went far beyond sexual tension or the impulse for mutual protection. There was a deep compatibility of values, dreams, and visions of the future that neither had experienced before in previous relationships. Emma blossomed in a way she didn't think possible. Free from the chains of the past and the threats of the present, she began to make decisions about her own life for the first time. She decided to return to studies, applying to college for education at a university in San Francisco, determined to transform her experience with Michael into a professional career helping other children. Ethan supported her plans unconditionally, offering to pay for her studies and reorganizing the estate's routine so she could attend classes. The relationship between them evolved naturally and organically. The nights that were once tortures of repressed desire transformed into long and intimate conversations where they explored not only physical attraction, but also their emotional wounds, their fears, their hopes for the future. Ethan revealed how he had felt emotionally dead for years, functioning only on autopilot, until Emma awakened feelings in him that he had forgotten existed. Emma, in turn, confessed how she had spent her entire life believing she was inadequate for love, that she carried the scars of her father's sins, until Ethan showed her that she deserved to be loved exactly as she was. The first time they made love was 6 months after Victoria's arrest, on a night of gentle rain that made the estate even more welcoming. There was no urgency or desperation, as in the stolen moments of the past. It was a conscious and deliberate surrender, where Emma could finally explore her sensuality without guilt or fear. Ethan treated her with a reverence that made her feel precious and desired, not as an object of obsession or possession, but as a complete and autonomous woman who chose to share herself with him. Emma's physical transformation over these months was remarkable. Her hair grew longer and shinier, her body gained more defined curves with better nutrition and less stress, but mainly her eyes lost that constant vigilance that had characterized her expression when she arrived at the estate. She smiled frequently now, a transformation that enchanted not only Ethan, but everyone who knew her. Michael especially flourished under the care of the new Emma, more confident, more loving, more present. Ethan also changed profoundly. The cold and controlled man Emma had known at the beginning had become someone capable of demonstrating vulnerability, of asking for help, of expressing emotions he had kept buried for decades. He began to be more actively involved in raising Michael, discovering simple joys of parenthood that he had missed during the years of toxic marriage with Victoria. In the afternoons, he could be found playing on the grass with his son while Emma studied, or teaching the boy about the vineyards with a patience he had never shown before. The healing process wasn't linear or simple. Emma still had occasional nightmares about the confrontation in the garden, sometimes waking during the early hours, checking if the doors were locked. Ethan carried deep guilt for not having perceived Victoria's destructive patterns before other women died, questioning himself about signs he might have seen if he hadn't been so emotionally asleep. They underwent individual and couple therapy, working through traumas that went far beyond the relationship between them. The local community reacted in a mixed way to the scandal. Some traditional families in the region harshly judged Ethan for getting involved with the former employee so quickly after his wife's arrest, whispering about impropriety and lack of decorum. Others, especially those who had lost domestic employees in suspicious circumstances over the years, supported Emma's courage in exposing the truth and sought out Ethan to share their own suspicions about Victoria. Gradually, a broader picture of systematic manipulation emerged, validating the initial discoveries and strengthening the legal case. Emma faced her own set of social challenges. Some people saw her as an opportunist who had taken advantage of the situation to move up in life, a cruel narrative that completely ignored the trauma she had suffered. Others treated her as a heroine, the brave woman who had exposed a murderer and saved future lives. Emma learned to navigate these external judgments with an inner strength she didn't know she possessed, focusing on the opinions of people who really mattered to her: Ethan, Michael, and the few true friends she made during her university studies. The evolution of her relationship with Michael became one of the most rewarding aspects of Emma's new life. The boy, now 4 years old, began to call her Mama Emma spontaneously, a change that made both her and Ethan cry with emotion. Emma dedicated herself to creating a stable and loving environment for the child, establishing healthy routines and family traditions that drastically contrasted with the tense and manipulative environment Michael had known in the first years of his life. She took him to swimming classes in town, organized picnics in the vineyards, read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, creating happy memories that would help heal the invisible wounds of his traumatic childhood. Ethan observed these interactions with a love that grew every day. Seeing Emma with Michael, he understood that he had found not just a lover or companion, but the mother his son needed and deserved. The natural ease with which she assumed this role, without ever trying to replace or erase the memory of the biological mother, demonstrated an emotional maturity that contrasted with her chronological age. Emma was only 23, but she had experienced traumas and overcomings that made her wise beyond her years. The first vacation they spent together as a family was revealing. Ethan rented a house on the coast of Southern California, away from the curious gazes of the Napa Valley community, where they could experience what it would be like to live as a normal family. Emma wore colorful bikinis that Ethan bought for her, played in the sand with Michael, learned to swim in the warm waters of the Pacific. Ethan watched her laugh freely under the California sun and realized he had never seen a more beautiful woman, not just physically but radiating a genuine happiness that transformed everything around her. During this vacation, they had deep conversations about the future. Emma admitted that sometimes she felt insecure about her place in his life, wondering if Ethan really loved her or if she just represented an escape from the toxicity of his previous marriage. Ethan responded with a brutal honesty that completely reassured her. He said he had confused obsession with love for so long that he had forgotten what the true feeling was like, until she appeared in his life. He explained that what he felt for her wasn't just passion or gratitude, but a deep certainty that they had been destined to meet, to save each other, to build something beautiful and lasting on the ruins of their painful pasts. Victoria's trial began in the second year after her arrest, attracting national attention due to the bizarre and systematic nature of her crimes. Emma was called as the main witness, and facing her former employer in court became a definitive test of her inner strength. Victoria had drastically lost weight in prison. Her once impeccable hair was grey and unkempt, but her eyes maintained the same calculating malice that Emma remembered from the darkest days at the estate. During her testimony, Victoria tried one last, desperate manipulation. She claimed she had been a victim of psychological abuse by Ethan, that her crimes were the result of a mental breakdown caused by years of betrayal and humiliation. She painted Emma as a calculating seductress who had deliberately destroyed a stable marriage to gain access to the Duval family wealth. Her words were poisonous and convincing, delivered with the same theatrical softness she had used to manipulate situations for years. Emma heard each accusation in silence, her hand intertwined with Ethan's in the gallery of the court. When it came her turn to respond to the allegations, she stood up with a dignity that impressed even the experienced judge. Her voice was calm but firm as she described the months of psychological terror she had suffered, the threatening anonymous letters, the discovery of Jessica's diary, and finally, the violent confrontation in the abandoned garden. She showed no hatred or desire for revenge, only an unwavering determination that the truth be known and that other women be protected. The most impactful moment of the trial came when Emma publicly revealed her true identity and the scandal involving her father. She had decided, against the advice of her lawyers, to be completely transparent about her past, denying Victoria the opportunity to use this information as blackmail. With a firm voice, she explained how she had fled Georgia to escape not only the violence of radical members of the old congregation, but also the crushing guilt for not being able to prevent the abuses when she was just a terrified teenager. The revelation caused a stir in the courtroom, but also humanized Emma in a powerful way. The prosecutor used her courage in exposing her own painful past as evidence of her credibility and strength of character. He argued that a person willing to sacrifice her privacy to ensure that the truth came to light wasn't someone capable of the calculating manipulations that Victoria alleged. The strategy worked, and public opinion began to definitively turn against the accused. The verdict was unanimous. Victoria was convicted of first-degree murder for Jessica's death, attempted homicide against Emma, and a series of other charges related to psychological crimes against previous victims. The sentence of 30 years in prison, without possibility of parole for the first 15 years, was received with applause in the packed gallery. Victoria was removed from the courtroom screaming incoherent threats and accusations, finally revealing the true face of the madness she had hidden for so many years. After the trial, Emma and Ethan returned to the estate with a feeling of relief and closure that neither had experienced in years. The property seemed different now, lighter, as if a dark shadow had finally been removed. They spent the following months renovating the house, especially transforming the abandoned garden where so many traumas had occurred. The old fountain was removed and replaced with a colorful playground for Michael, symbolizing the transformation from death to new life. Emma graduated in education with honors, her thesis on childhood trauma and resilience receiving national recognition. Ethan supported her decision to open a private school on the property, specifically aimed at children from rural families who had suffered various traumas. The Renewal School became a joint project where Emma could apply her theoretical knowledge, while Ethan used his resources and contacts to create educational opportunities that would transform the region. Michael, now 5 years old, flourished in the new environment. He became a confident and loving child with no visible traces of the traumas of the first years. He loved helping Emma with preparations for the school, organizing teaching materials, and creating colorful drawings to decorate the classrooms. His relationship with his father also deepened dramatically, with Ethan finally being able to demonstrate paternal affection without the emotional blocks that Victoria had created. On a starry December night, exactly 2 years after the trial, Ethan surprised Emma with a marriage proposal that was at once simple and deeply meaningful. He took her to the place where the abandoned garden used to be, now transformed into a beautiful children's recreation space, and said he wanted to officially formalize before God and society the commitment that already existed between them. The ring he offered wasn't ostentatious, but had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had known true love and had built a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Emma remained silent for long moments, not from hesitation, but from the overwhelming emotion of realizing how far she had come from that terrified girl who had arrived at the estate years before. When she finally answered yes, Her voice was loaded with tears of joy and gratitude. They embraced under the stars, with Michael sleeping peacefully in the main house, and for the first time, Emma felt that she truly belonged somewhere, that she had found not just a love but a home where she could be completely herself. Planning the wedding became a celebration of overcoming and community. Emma decided she wanted a simple but meaningful ceremony, inviting not only relatives and friends, but also the families of Victoria's other victims who had found justice through her courage. Ethan completely supported this decision, understanding that their wedding represented not just the union of two people, but the victory of truth over manipulation, of genuine love over sick obsession. Jessica's mother, Mrs. Reed, came especially from San Francisco for the ceremony. She was a simple woman who had lost her only daughter in circumstances she never fully understood until Victoria's trial. She embraced Emma with tears in her eyes, thanking her for giving voice to her dead girl, for ensuring that Jessica wasn't forgotten nor her death in vain. This moment of reconciliation and honor to the dead gave the wedding an emotional depth that touched all present. Emma chose to wear the wedding dress that had belonged to Ethan's mother, a vintage piece from the 1950s that needed to be adjusted but maintained its timeless elegance. It was a powerful symbol of healthy family continuity, dramatically contrasting with the toxic legacy that Victoria had tried to establish. Ethan, seeing Emma walking toward the improvised altar in the main garden of the estate, felt a deep peace he hadn't experienced since childhood, the sensation that he was finally in the right place, with the right person, at the right time. The ceremony was officiated by the pastor of the local church, an elderly man who had known Ethan since childhood and had witnessed the entire family saga. His words about forgiveness, redemption, and the human capacity to rise from the ashes of suffering deeply resonated with all present. When Emma and Ethan exchanged vows they had written themselves, there wasn't a dry eye in the assembly. Their vows spoke not of romanticized promises, but of real commitments, to support each other through nightmares and celebrations, to create a home where Michael and future children could grow without fear, to use their painful experiences to help others facing similar situations. Michael served as ring-bearer, wearing a small suit that made him look like an adorable miniature of his father. During the ceremony he held the rings with comic seriousness, but when the time came to deliver them, he whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Now Mama Emma will stay with us forever?" The innocent question from the child perfectly summarized the deep meaning of that moment. It wasn't just about romantic love, but about the creation of a genuine family built on solid foundations of trust and mutual care. The reception was held on the porch of the main house, decorated with wildflowers that Emma had personally planted in the previous months. The food was prepared by women from the region who had become friends with Emma during her university studies, creating an atmosphere of community and support that dramatically contrasted with the social isolation Victoria had imposed on the family for years. Live music played by local musicians filled the air with melodies that celebrated both tradition and renewal. 5 years after the wedding, the Duval estate had completely transformed. The renewal school prospered with more than 60 students from throughout the region, many of them children who had suffered family traumas and found in Emma's innovative methodology a chance for healing and healthy growth. Ethan had expanded the family businesses to include sustainable rural tourism, allowing visitors to experience country life while contributing to the local economy. The couple had achieved something rare, transforming inherited wealth into genuine social impact. Emma, now 28, had blossomed in a way that surprised even herself. Her master's thesis on childhood resilience had been published as a book, becoming a national reference for educators and psychologists. She frequently lectured at universities about how to transform trauma into strength, using her own story as an example that the past doesn't determine the future. Physically, she had matured into a serene and confident beauty that dramatically contrasted with the frightened girl who had arrived at the estate years before. Michael, now 8 years old, was a brilliant and caring boy who held no traumatic memories of the first years. He called Emma Mom naturally, without ever having been forced to do so, and had developed a special relationship with the school children who faced difficulties similar to what he had unconsciously experienced. Ethan observed his son helping younger colleagues with a patience that echoed Emma's, realizing how genuine love had broken destructive cycles that could have perpetuated for generations. The big surprise came on a golden September morning. Emma discovered she was pregnant with the couple's first biological child. The news was received with intense joy, but also with understandable anxiety. Both wanted to ensure that this new life would grow in an even healthier environment than they had managed to create for Michael. Ethan was overwhelmed with emotion at imagining a child who would be born knowing only love, security, and stability, without the shadows that had marked both his childhood and Emma's. Michael received the news that he would be a big brother with typical childish enthusiasm. He immediately began to plan how he would teach soccer to the baby, how he would protect it from any danger, how he would share his favorite toys. Emma and Ethan observed these childish preparations with hearts full of gratitude, realizing they had managed to create a family where love multiplied instead of dividing, where each new addition strengthened rather than threatened existing bonds. During the pregnancy, Emma faced some natural fears related to her past. She worried if she would be able to be a good mother, considering that her own parental models had been so dysfunctional. Ethan constantly reassured her, reminding her of how she had cared for Michael, of how her interactions with the school children demonstrated natural and healthy maternal instincts. Continued therapy helped Emma process these anxieties, transforming them into determination to definitively break any negative cycle she might have inherited. The daughter was born on a rainy May afternoon, healthy and perfect, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's serene smile. They called her Jessica Emma Duval, honoring both Victoria's first victim and Emma's own journey. The name initially caused some controversy in the extended family, but Ethan was inflexible. His daughter would carry a name that represented justice, memory, and renewal. Michael was the first to hold his little sister, whispering childish promises of protection that made the parents cry with emotion. Victoria, serving her sentence in a state penitentiary, learned of the birth through news that occasionally reached her from the outside world. Her reaction was a mixture of impotent anger and a deep sadness that she struggled not to recognize. In the solitude of her cell, she sometimes wondered how her life could have been different if she had chosen genuine love instead of obsessive control, if she had sought help for her destructive impulses instead of systematically feeding them. But these moments of lucidity were rare and quickly smothered by the bitterness that had become her constant companion. The estate continued to prosper under the joint leadership of Emma and Ethan. They implemented innovative, sustainable agriculture programs, created a research center on childhood trauma in partnership with national universities, and established a scholarship fund that allowed young people from poor rural families to attend university. Each project reflected their personal experiences, transformed into strength to help others. On quiet nights when the children were asleep and the day's work was finished, Emma and Ethan still met on the porch of the main house, observing the stars and talking about their dreams for the future. The passion between them had evolved into something even deeper, a complete partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and a love that had been tested by the most extreme adversities and emerged even stronger. They knew they had created something rare and precious, a genuine family built on honesty, mutual care, and the shared determination to transform suffering into growth, darkness into light, fear into lasting love. 10 years after her arrival at the estate, Emma stood in the same place where she had gotten off the bus on that rainy March afternoon that seemed to belong to a previous life. But now she held Jessica Emma, already a chatty and curious 5-year-old girl, while Michael, at 13, helped Ethan receive a group of journalists who had come to document the success of the Renewal School. The transformation was so complete that sometimes Emma needed to pinch herself to believe it was all real. The school had become a national model, receiving visits from educators from across the country interested in replicating Emma's methodology. The program for recovering traumatized children had been adopted by various institutions, and Emma frequently traveled to give lectures and training. Ethan always accompanied her on these trips, not out of jealousy or insecurity, but because he genuinely admired her work and wanted to support every aspect of her growing career. The estate had expanded to include a research center in partnership with the University of California, where students of education, psychology, and social work did practical internships working with children in vulnerable situations. Ethan had discovered an unexpected vocation as a social manager, using his business skills to create financial sustainability for programs that traditionally depended only on inconsistent donations. Michael had grown into an admirable young man with his father's emotional intelligence and his adoptive mother's natural compassion. He planned to study child psychology, inspired by the stories he heard at school about children who managed to overcome seemingly insurmountable traumas. Jessica Emma, in turn, showed early signs of natural leadership, organizing other children in elaborate games and demonstrating an impressive ability to mediate conflicts among peers. Every Christmas, the family had a special tradition of visiting Jessica Reed's grave in San Francisco, bringing fresh flowers and telling the first Jessica about the year's achievements. Emma had established this tradition to ensure that the children grew up understanding that their current happiness was built on the courage of a young woman who paid the ultimate price for exposing the truth. It was a way to keep alive the memory of all Victoria's victims and to teach the new generations about the importance of justice and moral courage. The letters that Emma occasionally received from other survivors of similar situations had become a constant source of inspiration. Women from across America wrote telling how her story, disseminated through interviews and her book, had given them courage to report abuses, leave toxic relationships, or simply believe they deserved to be genuinely loved. Emma responded to each letter personally, creating an informal support network that transcended geographical and social barriers. Ethan frequently observed his wife interacting with these women during public events or conferences, seeing how she radiated a silent strength that inspired others to find their own courage. He felt proud not just to have her as a companion, but to have been part of the journey that allowed her to transform from victim to advocate, from survivor to leader, from wounded woman to healing force for countless others. On the eve of the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Emma and Ethan walked together to the place where the abandoned garden used to be, now a colorful playground where their own children played daily. Emma touched her slightly rounded belly. She was pregnant again, this time with twins. The news had been received with explosive joy by the whole family, especially by Jessica Emma, who was eager to teach the babies everything she knew about life on the estate. As they watched the stars that seemed brighter that night, Emma reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. From the absolute terror of that deadly confrontation in the garden to the deep peace she felt now, she had traveled an emotional distance that seemed impossible to measure. Ethan held her hand, intertwining their fingers as they did every night for years, and whispered that he loved her not just for what they had built together, but for who she had chosen to become despite everything she had suffered. Emma smiled, knowing that she had finally found not just true love but also herself.